Hello and welcome to the Rating Room podcast. It's Jay and Andy again.
Today we're recording another special episode, something a little bit different. From the Status Alternative podcast, please welcome our special guest, Brittany. Brittany, thanks for being on the show. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast?
Hi, so my name is Brittany. I'm from Chicago, Illinois. I have the Status Alternative podcast. On my podcast, I talk about like four major topics like professional wrestling, hard rock and heavy metal music, anime, and comic books.
That's brilliant. So just before we start today's episode, we've got a couple of quick questions. So how did you get into wrestling?
So I got into wrestling like right around late 2005, early 2006. I kind of missed the boom on the whole like 90s professional wrestling. So me and my brothers got into right around like 2006, and we've been fans ever since.
Any particular favorites in terms of wrestlers or companies, or is it just, do you watch as much as possible, or do you have specific shows that you like to watch?
So from 2006 to like 2009, it was WWE all day, every day. Then after like 2009, 2010, I started getting into Impact Wrestling. So back then it was called TNA Impact. So I got into that. Then like eventually I lost interest with that. Ended up going back to WWE like on and off up until like 2020. And then when AEW got announced, I got big into that. And some of my favorite wrestlers in WWE were like Shawn Michaels, Triple H, Shelton Benjamin. CM Punk eventually became like the dude I really, really was a huge fan of. And then in TNA, it was Samoa Joe, AJ Styles, Matt Morgan. And then in AEW, it's been like Darby Allin, Orange Cassidy, The Acclaim, Top Flight, Kenny Omega, those kind of guys.
Great stuff. I'm a fan of a lot of those myself. And I guess you mentioned you're from Chicago, so CM Punk he's a hometown hero, isn't he?
Yeah.
Jay, you mentioned you're not a fan. Did you ever watch any as a kid, or was it just never on your radar?
Yeah, so me and one of my brothers, we used to watch it when I was younger. And when I was in my early 20s, I took my youngest brother, because he's 14 years younger than me, I took him to Nottingham to watch WWE. I think it was the Raw show. So we saw The Undertaker, I think back then. This is years and years ago, this was. And I can't remember any other wrestlers, to be honest. But from watching on the TV, when I first started watching it, is when people like Ultimate Warrior, Randy Savage, Hulk Hogan. So I'm only a few years older than you, Andy.
We are the old boys, yeah. Randy Savage was my first favourite, and then this big guy called The Undertaker debuted, and I was like obsessed from that point onwards. We could talk wrestling for hours and hours and hours, but we're going to talk movies as well. I have another question for you, Brittany, and this is kind of the inverse of what we're going to talk about as the main thread of the pod. But do you think there are any movie stars that might make good wrestlers?
Ooh. So there's this one guy who is on the TV show Stars, which is about like professional wrestlers. Stephen Amell being one of them, actually. He would make a good one because he's done like an all-out show for AEW. He would be good. His co-star, I believe, I can't remember his name, but I remember his last name's like Maldonado. He's a character on the show. I think he would be good. Maybe Michael B. Jordan, because he's already done boxing, so maybe. Let's see. I'm trying to think if there's like any like female actresses that would be like interested in playing like wrestlers, but I don't know. None really comes to mind.
Yeah, put you on the spot there a little bit. That is a good question, though. From a female side, I think this is showing my age. But Jay, if you think back to the A View to a Kill episode, Grace Jones as Mayday, she was badass. Stick her in a wrestling ring, I think mayhem could ensue.
Yeah, she could look after herself, couldn't she?
Yeah.
Definitely.
No, interesting.
I think I'm trying to think, because I don't really watch action films, to be honest, Andy. So I can't really think of many actors or actresses that do action films. But Charlize Theron did a good action film a few years ago that was on Netflix. I think she would be a good wrestler.
Yeah, no arguments from me. Should we get into the episode proper? Jay, why don't you kick us off with the theme of today's podcast?
Yeah, so as we've mentioned in season 1, obviously we're rewatching James Bond franchise, and especially in the earlier films, myself and Andy have picked out several wrestlers that have been in the Bond franchise. So today we wanted to kind of combine the worlds of film and sports entertainment. So kicking us off, I'm just going to list some famous wrestlers in films. So Hulk Hogan has appeared in Rocky 3, Suburban Commando, and Mr. Nanny, the classic Mr. Nanny. I remember watching that as a kid. We've also got The Rock, also goes by his real name, Dwayne Johnson, who has appeared in the Mummy's Returns, Fast and Furious franchise, and Black Adam. I've only seen a few of the Fast and Furious films. I've seen The Mummy Returns, but I've not seen Black Adam. That only came out a few months ago, actually. And then John Cena has been in Trainwreck, Blockers, Bumblebee, and The Suicide Squad.
Yeah, I'm going to show my age again here and go back in time a little bit. I remember Jesse Ventura, or Jesse the Body Ventura as he was also known, appeared in films like Predator, The Running Man, Demolition Man, and in Batman and Robin. And the late, great Rowdy Roddy Piper appeared in such films as They Live, Body Slam, and one that the title says it all, Pro Wrestlers vs. Zombies. That sounds like an amazing film.
So, like, two that I remember, this one, not really kind of showing my age, because I think these guys kind of stopped wrestling when I started getting into it. Stone Cold Steve Austin, who was in The Condemned, The Expendables, and one of my favorite, like, Adam Sandler movies, The Longest Yard. Another one that I remember, obviously Kevin Nash, who has recently started appearing in films. One of my also favorites, he also starred in The Longest Yard with Stone Cold Steve Austin. He was in The Punisher, which was like one of my favorite adaptations of The Punisher. And he was also in Magic Mike, which was hilarious seeing that for the first time.
So out of some of those films that we've just listed, I've not seen many of them, if I'm being honest. I remember Jesse Ventura in Predator, The Running Man. I don't remember him Demolition Man, but that was a film that I used to have on VHS when I was a kid. I used to love Demolition Man. But other than that, you know, in terms of the ones you've mentioned, Andy, and you, Brittany, I've not seen many of those ones.
I had smile when mentioning The Longest Yard. I completely agree with you. It's a great Adam Sandler film. And, you know, the wrestler connection doesn't end with Austin and Nash. We've got Goldberg in there, the great Carly as well. Maybe one or two others as well that escape me right now. But yeah, that's a fantastic film. I've not seen the original because it was a remake from was it the 70s with Burt Reynolds? I've not seen the Burt Reynolds version, but Adam Sandler I thought was really good in it.
And Burt Reynolds appears in the remake, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm. So some other wrestlers that you probably aren't familiar with that have appeared in parts of major movies include Randy Orton. He's played in a couple of movies, one in particular with Seth Green, as well as a couple of the WWE produced films. Roman Reigns was actually in the Hobbs and Shaw spinoff from the Fast and Furious franchise. Chris Jericho has been in a couple. He was in that MacGruber movie, I believe, which was like kind of like a Saturday Night Live film. Ronda Rousey has played in The Expendables. I remember seeing her in that. Wade Barrett was in a movie. I don't remember the name of it. It was another WWE produced film, but he also played in a movie with Colin Farrell. And CM Punk has done like a couple of indie movies. One in particular, The Girl on the Third Floor. Mostly some like horror themed like films.
Yeah, Punk's big horror, and he's a big comic book fan as well, isn't he? I'm led to believe so. That's right in his wheelhouse, isn't it?
Yeah, he ended up doing like a mini series of a Drax comic book for Marvel.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Sorry, so just before we move on, you both mentioned, well, Brittany, you definitely mentioned about the wrestling kind of film studio. What are those films like? Are they all action films, or I think you just mentioned about horror film? Do they tend to be action films?
Some of them, like I remember Edge was in one. It was a comedy one. He played like some like really laid back detective. Triple H was in one called The Chaperone. Big Show was in one called Knucklehead. Some of them were comedy, some of them were action. Dean Ambrose, who now goes by the name John Moxley, he was in one. The Miz was in one. So, and Kane was in like See No Evil. So they mostly do either action films, comedies, and like maybe a couple of horror movies.
Yeah, it's quite the selection. They've also they did a link up maybe 7-8 years ago now with Scooby Doo. So there was a series of Scooby Doo films with wrestlers in. I think there was one like Scooby Doo Goes to WrestleMania or something that had loads of cameos from the different wrestlers at the time. So some animated things as well. I don't know if the studios are still up and running. I don't know if they've kind of died a death a little bit, or certainly on pause, but I don't recall hearing of any movies out in recent years. Maybe the pandemic put paid to some of that.
So before The Rock became a Hollywood superstar in terms of films, did he do any of the WWE films? You know, those kind of produced ones.
I don't think he did. I don't think they really had a studios at that point. They were kind of, I think the first one he did, and Brittany, please jump in if I've got this wrong. I think it was The Mummy Returns, but he was only a bit part player in that, and then that led to The Scorpion King, and Vince McMahon would have had like executive producer rights to it, but it wasn't a WWE film per se. But I think appearances of that nature, and I think around the similar time, Triple H appeared in Blade 3 as a vampire, and it was around that time they kind of saw money in doing it themselves, and that's how they kind of started on that in a bit more seriously, with the likes of John Cena and The Miz and Randy Orton in like the Marine films. I think maybe 6 Marine films now there is or something, and obviously the ones Brittany mentioned earlier as well.
So let's get back and focus on the James Bond franchise. Obviously, you know, like I said earlier, myself and Andy have mentioned that some of the wrestlers have appeared when we watched the film. So do you want to kick us off, Andy?
Indeed, I do. So a couple of names that come to mind straight away. Harold Sakata, who played Oddjob in Goldfinger in 1964, was a famous wrestler. And we've mentioned The Rock already. His grandfather, Peter Maivia, was one of Osato's henchmen in 1967's You Only Live Twice.
So a couple that I remember, or a couple I wasn't too familiar with, but it was like kind of an interesting fact. John Saru as Gaber in The World Is Not Enough. You have Sonny Calendez as Craw in The Man with the Golden Gun. Yuri Barenko as Grunther in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. He was like a Russian wrestler. And of course, Dave Bautista as Mr. Hinks Inspector.
And then a couple from me is Milton Reed, who plays Sandor in The Spy Who Loved Me, and Joe Robinson as Peter Franks in Diamonds Are Forever. From that list, Dave Bautista is the one that really jumps out. He must be the most famous wrestler that's appeared in the Bond franchise. I
would tend to agree. Certainly today. If you asked me that question 50 years ago, obviously not, but based on just the other name that comes to mind is Peter Maivia, but I'm not sure how well known he is with today's audience. But yeah, I would agree with that.
Was he big then in wrestling?
I mean, he predates me, but in terms of his accomplishments, we're going to get into them in a little while. But yeah, he was a big deal in terms of wrestling history. Just the whole family, and then the link to like the Samoan heritage. There's a whole bloodline of Samoan wrestlers that have that are making names for themselves even to this day, and probably will for many, many generations to come.
Okay, so let's focus on a few of these now. So Oddjob from Goldfinger, obviously Andy mentioned, played by Harold Sakata, and he's got to be one of the best henchmen from the Bond franchise. Myself and Andy actually was talking about Oddjob in a previous guest episode.
Yeah, so another little fact about Harold Sakata, not only was he a wrestler in the professional sense and an actor, he was also a silver medalist at the 1948 Summer Olympics for the US, which brings to mind a certain Kurt Angle who would go on to win a gold medal in the 96 Olympics. Goldfinger was Sakata's first film role, probably his most famous role, you'd have to say. And in terms of his professional wrestling, he was known as the Human Tank, Mr. Sakata, and also Tosh Togo. wrestled in America and Canada and also in Japan.
So my familiarity with Dave Bautista, because right when I started watching, that was like big for me to watch him. Like my mom was a huge fan, I was a huge fan. So him playing Mr. Hanks from Spectre was like a very big deal for his career. Now, I don't really know if he was in this film before he signed on with Guardians of the Galaxy, but I remember he was starting to make waves. Batista would go on to become the latest professional wrestler to feature in a Bond film. Batista had a successful wrestling career and has also featured in numerous films. He's probably the most famous wrestler on the list and wrestler with the best film career. I would agree with that because John Cena is solid, but as far as like going like as an in-depth toe-to-toe actor, I would say Batista has shown like very big strides. And of course, he's a multi-time world champion. He's main evented WrestleMania twice, was part of Evolution, which was a stable with Triple H, Randy Orton, and Ric Flair.
Yeah, so he was due to be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2020 before COVID hit. Batista's been in numerous films. One of the things I like about Batista is he doesn't just do action films. He does lots of different roles. So he kind of demonstrates his action chops here. So I'm just going to list a few here. So as Brittany mentioned, Guardians of the Galaxy has appeared in volumes 1, 2, and volume 3 is coming out in the not too distant future. He's also appeared in Avengers in Infinity War, Endgame, and also Thor Love and Thunder as Drax. And he's also appeared in Blade Runner 2049 and Dune as well. And he's also due to feature in part 2 of Dune, which is out in 2023, which is this year. He's also featured with Daniel Craig in Glass Onion, A Knives Out Mystery, which is a highly recommended film. And he's also a member of the zombie killing heist film Army of Dead, which again I think is a good film as well. And apparently they're making a sequel, and the prequel of that is very good as well. So I don't know if any of you two have seen many of those films.
Yeah, so I've seen Batista in Guardians of the Galaxy 1 and 2. I don't think I've seen any of the others on the list though, but the Knives Out films do look really good. Is he due to be or is in a M. Night Shyamalan film that's either coming out very soon or has come out recently? Well, I've got my timing all wrong there, but that looked pretty good. And again, a different role for him. He's definitely not a one-trick pony, that's for sure. What about you, Brittany? What's your familiarity with Batista films?
So I've seen him in obviously Guardians of Galaxy 1 and 2. I saw him in Hotel Artemis, which was like a Jodie Foster indie film that kind of was like there for like a quick second. He is going to be in that M. Night Shyamalan movie that is coming out, I believe, later this year. And it's a horror movie, which I'm interested to see him in. He's done like, let's see, any of the other films. I think that's about it. And I have yet to see the new Knives Out. I thought Army of the Dead was pretty interesting. I liked it. It was really good.
Yes.
I was doing a bit of live researching then when you two were just chatting, and apparently he's going to appear in Army of Dead Lost Vegas, which is a TV series. Andy, did you say you've seen Army of Dead?
No, I've not seen that. No, but
okay.
Interesting.
I won't give spoilers away.
Interesting that it's transitioning to TV. Seems to be a more popular thing these days. Movie actors becoming TV stars. Maybe that's where the money is. I don't know. But it certainly seems to be a thing these days. I want to add another one to the list to go in a little bit of deep dive. So I mentioned Peter Maivia from You Only Live Twice. The real-life grandfather of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. So Dwayne is actually a third-generation wrestler. His father, Rocky Johnson, was married to Peter Maivia's daughter. That's how the lineage falls down there. The one and only appearance in film for Peter Maivia was this film. So not a movie career of any distinction, but in pro wrestling he was known as the High Chief, and I think that was a legitimate title he held in the Samoan heritage, so that was a big deal. And in 2008, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame by his grandson, The Rock.
So this next section, I'm going to kind of pass it over to Brittany and Andy here, because obviously we've mentioned my knowledge of wrestlers is slim to non-existent. So the first question I'm going to pose to both of you is, what wrestlers would make a good Bond villain? Brittany, do you want to go first?
So being a fan for the past like 18 years, I've seen like a bevy of like storylines that have gone on across like many promotions. So one, I would say top of the list, Randy Orton. Like if you were a fan of professional wrestling during like 2009 WWE, Randy Orton was like the most despicable character on television that you could witness like day in, day out. So I got to say Randy Orton's on the top of the list for that. Roman, just because the current run he's on right now, for like a short period of time, he was like very like, he didn't have a lot of the fans backing him, but this most recent run as like head of the table, it's gotten a lot of people interested in the story he's kind of going with now. I would say Kenny Omega because he's such a huge video game fan and he's such a video game nerd that I think he would like really, really show a convincing like Bond villain just because of like he has that history of being such a like larger than life personality. I went with Claudio Castagnoli. He was formerly known as Cesaro in WWE. The only reason why I picked him or I suggest him is because he has this sort of stature. Like he's like known to be deceptively strong. He's super tall, and plus he has that sort of like international like type of man of mystery. He's like just like he's just very interesting. And I think he would make a really good Bond villain because he's played that whole sinister type of character before. And then lastly, I would say like Drew McIntyre because I don't know, he just kind of seems like he'd be into like playing a villain of some type.
Yeah, I saw your list in the notes a few days ago, and I thought, yeah, that is a really good list, and all very, very different as well. There's not like a specific type in there. You've got your mention of Randy Orton in 2009, absolutely perfect. He was despicable. He was a vile human being in that time. So yeah, really, really like that list. I'm gonna add a few more for different reasons as well to that list. So the first name that came to mind was Vince McMahon. And it brought me in mind of Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Blofeld being the leader of an evil organization. And it could be argued that Vince McMahon himself is the leader of a very evil organization, depending on who you want to listen to. So he would definitely fit that role. In the henchman category, two similar kind of wrestlers in terms of their build and their demeanor, and that's Solo Sikoa and Bronson Reed. Bronson being slightly larger of the two. I just think they have that physical intimidation, that presence. They just stand in the background, look menacing, and at a moment's notice can kick ass on command. So I think they'd make good henchmen. The next name is I've got Jeff Jarrett. Now I'm a big fan of Jeff Jarrett. I'm a big fan of his podcast, but a lot of people just seem to hate him. Like he's and he's been hated for 30 odd years. And I don't really know why, because by all accounts, he's a pretty good guy and, you know, he's a great wrestler and he's got wrestling heritage, but he is really hated. So I think if you want someone hated in your film, Jeff Jarrett's the guy to call. And the final, two names I've got in mind was me thinking of Jaws, you know, the giant type role. Braun Strowman and Omos. Braun Strowman, I think, is sort of 6'8", 6'9", big monster. Omos is 7 foot plus. He might even be like taller than Andre the Giant was legitimately. So like a huge human being. And if you had a Jaws type role in future, one of those two would fit that mold. So that's my list. But you sure you don't remember any, Jay, from your past? Do you want to throw a name into the hat so you don't feel left out?
So while you've been talking, I've been Googling some of these. So Randy Orton, wasn't he with Batista and Triple H, like in a little gang? I remember seeing them on TV at one point.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think Brittany mentioned it earlier in the podcast. They were in Evolution.
Oh, is that the name? Okay. So, and one of the ones you just mentioned, Andy, didn't he fight Tyson Fury in a wrestling match not too long ago?
Yes, Braun Strowman in 2019, 2018, 2019, around that sort of time. They had a fight in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I follow boxing, and I remember seeing him and Tyson. No, I can't really. My wrestling knowledge is from the old days, so I can't really pick anyone currently. But a little question I just want to throw at you both. If you were in a Bond film, would you be the henchman or woman, or would you be like the main villain?
Do you want to take that one first, Brittany?
Yeah, I think I would. I don't know. I think I'd be the villain rather than the henchwoman. Actually, you know what? I would switch that because, like, for some strange reason, so I'm 5'8", so like to a lot of my coworkers at work, I kind of tower over them. So, and like a couple of my friends do say I'm a bit intimidating. So I think I would make a very good henchwoman just based on my height alone.
Well, in that case, I'll be the villain and get you to do all my dirty work because I don't like fighting. I'm not physically intimidating at all. I'm 6'1", but that's probably quite average, isn't it, for a guy these days? But yeah, there's nothing intimidating about me at all. So I'll cause the trouble and get you to finish it off as my henchwoman. That's how that works.
So moving on, we've obviously talked about Bond villains, and one of the other things from the Bond films that we're monitoring in the our main season of the rating room is Bond girls. So Andy, what kind of suggestions do you have in terms of women from wrestling that could be a good Bond girl?
So I've kind of broken this down into almost 3 different eras because the Bond franchise as it's evolved, the role of Bond girl has kind of evolved with it as well. So back in like the Connery era, someone like a Miss Elizabeth would have made a good Bond girl. Very, very classy, very sophisticated, a true lady. She was married to Macho Man Randy Savage back in the 80s, and she acted as his manager. She was kind of, she was. I think she was actually called the First Lady of Wrestling. Not necessarily true because women wrestlers have been around for many, many years beforehand. But yeah, she was kind of the first one in the mainstream that really added that level of sophistication to the valet type role that never been seen before. So I think she'd be a good fit for the Connery era. As the Bond franchise rolled on, we've talked about this particularly in, say, the Moore films. A lot of Bond girls were cast in this kind of damsel in distress type role, or, for lack of a better term, eye candy. They weren't given the roles, they weren't given the lines. They were just kind of there to be a side piece to Bond, which was the kind of that was the role at the time back in the 70s. 2 names that I think could fit that would be Sonny and Sable. So they were both big names in the 90s in WWE. I think at one point Sonny was the most downloaded celebrity on the internet one year. So, she was very, very popular with the masses. So I think one of those 2 could fit that kind of role. And then if we bring things into the modern time, the Bond girl has changed into a more independent woman, a real badass. And when I think of badass Bond girls and I think of badass wrestlers, 3 names that came to mind were Trish Stratus, one of the best women wrestlers of recent times. Nikita Lyons from NXT. She is a true badass in every sense of the word. And then I've gone for the AEW wrestler Toni Storm as well for similar reasons. I think those 3, I wouldn't want to meet them in a fight, that's for sure.
Do you have a view on those ones, Brittany, before you suggest yours?
I do agree with like Andy's like assessment of how these women have their roles sort of changed over the years as the Bond films sort of went with the times of current events. I have 3 like I have 5 suggestions. So like out of the 5, 3 of them mostly for their athleticism and their physical stature. The first one would be from WWE, Bianca Belair. Just like for her stature alone and just the way she moves in the ring is like something to behold and something to see. So I would go with Bianca Belair. I would go with Charlotte, also from WWE. Just her general, like her athletic background and her gymnast background. Obviously, that's who I would go with. Jade Cargill because of not only looks, but just like there's been a lot of like emphasis on muscular women in professional wrestling as of late. So those 3 just off looks, athleticism, and just sheer badassery. Mercedes Moné, formerly known as Sasha Banks. Mostly I would go with her because of the way she looks and her star power, and like she has those type of roles kind of down packed of looking like a star. She was in the most recent episodes of The Mandalorian for the Star Wars series. And Chelsea Green, just because I think she has that look of being the damsel in distress type. So those are my five.
So I've got a question. We've obviously, I just posed that question to you there about Bond Gal, but out of the wrestlers that you've listed, any of those stand out in terms of being a Bond Gal and villain? Because obviously we've seen people like Mayday, Xena on a top, Electra King, where they are also a villain, but also a Bond Gal. Anyone jump out from your list?
Probably Jade Cargill because her current run on AEW is like she's kind of being known as like she's a very big like talker, like a trash talker. So her being intimidating, her looking the way that she does, and her character currently right now, it fits like a glove to be a Bond villain and a Bond girl.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to steal from your list as well with Jade Cargill, for those reasons, and add to the fact that as of recording, she's still undefeated. Nobody can stop her. So, who's going to come along and save the day? Is she ever going to be defeated? That's we asked that question from a wrestling point of view, but that's kind of how films work as well. When you have this unstoppable force, who is going to be the one to finally take them down in the end?
So a follow-up question to you both. Out of the wrestlers that you suggested for Bond villains and Bond gals, if you had to pick one from both lists, so you pick one Bond villain and one Bond gal, who would you pick to be in like your perfect Bond film?
I would say go with someone like a Vince McMahon and a Charlotte Flair. And I think for different reasons. I think they've both got that kind of power around them, whether it's actual power in terms of leading an organization or whether it's just that power of being so influential in the business of wrestling. And that could translate quite nicely onto the screen. But I think they would make a very good villainous couple. Not necessarily like romantically, but just as a duo on screen. I think that pairing could work.
So would Charlotte Flair not only be a Bond gal, she would also be a villain? So she's not a goodie.
She'd be under the villainous reign of Vince McMahon, and he would have many, many henchmen and women around him, but she would be kind of number two in the organization, as it were. She'd be the what am I thinking of? Rosa Klebb? Is that what I mean? The Klebb to McMahon's Blofeld.
Yeah. How about you, Brittany? If you had just had to pick one villain from your list or Andy's list and then one Bond gal from either of your list, who would you pick?
I think just for the sake of like it being like a little bit like how does this work and it works so well, I would choose Jeff Jarrett as the Bond villain because he's just that type of guy that elicits like an angry reaction out of people. And I think I would choose I think I would choose Jade Cargill as like the like the like a henchwoman, if you will, because it's like how does this work? Because like Jeff Jarrett's kind of like a slimy type of character, and you have like Jade Cargill who could come in, be intimidating in the background while he's like going on his evil monologue, and like Jade's like in the background standing, like very intimidating.
Yeah, it's a good choice. I think we're coming up to the end of our episode, so we'll wrap things up. Is there any final thoughts from either of you in terms of Bond versus movie versus anything really in this genre?
I haven't heard you two mention it, so I don't know if people have been in this type of film. But do you tend to get, because I like watching sci-fi films, do you get wrestlers appearing in sci-fi films? Not counting, if you don't class comic book as kind of like sci-fi within the sci-fi genre.
I think, well, Brittany mentioned Sasha Banks, Mercedes Monet in The Mandalorian. Well, that's a series rather than a film, but that would very much fit that sci-fi mold, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I've seen The Mandalorian, but I don't know who Sasha Banks is. So after we finish recording, I'm going to Google who that is so I can find out.
I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever seen like that many wrestlers. It would be a good fit because like I said before, a lot of them are kind of like nerdy, so they're into that type of sci-fi comic books. They're into video games. I would like to see more wrestlers in video games. That would just be my opinion because I think that would be like obviously you see them in the wrestling simulators, but I think a lot of them would get a kick. Like I know Kenny Omega appeared in like one of the Street Fighter games that came out like a while back, like a couple of years ago. But I'd be interested in seeing that.
Am I right in thinking Zelina Vega is going to be in Street Fighter 6 or has participated in some way with the making of Street Fighter 6? I seem to recall her. So at this year's Royal Rumble, she came out dressed as one of the Street Fighter characters. And I think on commentary they made mention of her involvement in the Street Fighter game. But I'm not sure of the details of that.
I think you are correct in that. And while you were saying that, I just remembered they used Ronda Rousey's likeness to be Sonya Blade in the most recent Mortal Kombat game.
Oh, there you go. So more of that, please, I think is what we're asking for. But no, that's a good question, Jay.
I've just live Google. So yes, I do recognize. Well, I don't recognize Sasha Banks, but I recognize her from The Mandalorian. And Andy, the wrestler that you just mentioned, Zelina Vega, will be a commentator in Street Fighter 6.
Well, there you go. We'll say that's a world exclusive, even though it's clearly not. So you can edit that bit out. But no, that's good to get that kind of discussion. So I think we'll call proceedings to a close at this point. Brittany, thank you very much for taking the time to appear on the episode with us. Listeners out there, check out Status Alternative Podcasts wherever you find your favorite podcasts. I know there's a bunch on Spotify, and in all the usual places you'll find there's a whole bunch of episodes out there. So check that out and any future ones as well. And also listen out for more special episodes of The Rating Room in future, where we'll have more special guests, more talk of all things James Bond. But in the meantime, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time, right here on The Rating Room.
Well, that's this week's episode done. We hope you enjoyed it.
Special thanks to the band Sugar Tongue for the theme tune to The Rating Room. You can find them on all the usual social media channels, and be sure to check out their song The System, available now on Spotify.
You can find and message us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok and Instagram by searching The Rating Room.
You'll find all our social media links on our website, theratingroom.com, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or feel free to drop us an email at theratingroom@gmail.com. Goodbye, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week, right here on The Rating Room.
Rating Room. The Rating Room. The Rating Room. The Rating Room.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back for season 2 of the Status Alternative Podcast. We are going to have more comics, more manga, more anime, more professional wrestling, more bands to recommend. So, with that all being said, gear up, sit back, relax, and enjoy your favorite podcast, the Status Alternative Podcast. And remember to stay alternative.